This video is going to be the makeup for Thursday since we didn't get to come because of the ice. We're going to super briefly finish chapter 4, which was the tissues chapter. We had made it through all of the tables, and so basically we needed to start at the cutaneous membrane. So find where that is in the notes, and then we're going to go ahead and start. All right, the next part of the chapter starts to summarize how you put different tissues together to basically start to make membranes and then organs, and then how tissues can go wrong to start to form cancer. So starting with the cutaneous membrane is skin. It's the only dry membrane that you have in the body. It's made out of epidermis, which is the part that's this top portion up here, and then you have dermis down below that, and then hypodermis is even lower than that, and so that's basically the makeup of the cutaneous membrane. You also need to know that it's there for protection. So it's a dry membrane, it's multiple cells thick, and it's there for protection. After that, you have a mucous membrane. Mucous membranes are going to be attached to any body surface that's open to the exterior, so the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, the urinary system, the respiratory system, all of those are going to be lined by mucous membrane. Mucous membranes tend to be simple columnar or pseudostratified columnar. They have lamina propria down underneath them instead of dermis, and then below that you start to run into either muscle or different kinds of connective tissue. Mucous membranes are specialized for the production of mucus, and they are wet membranes, and the key to them is, again, they're always open to the outside world. Next thing that you have is the lamina propria. So I mentioned a second ago, you can find these in mucous membranes. They are just under the epithelial tissue. Okay. Hopefully you guys recognize this bracketed portion that is labeled C. That is your simple columnar epithelial tissue. There are some goblet cells scattered throughout there. Underneath that you have what we've already basically labeled as basement membrane, but basement membrane in a mucous membrane is called lamina propria. And so it's all of this area down where I'm running the arrow through just under the simple columnar. So right through here is all lamina propria. In the cartoony picture, it's labeled for you up here. It's in between all the simple columnar that's waving up and down to make these little finger-like projections that are called villi. You'll learn a little bit more about the makeup of the intestines when we get to AMP2 in the digestive tract. But the lamina propria is just the connective tissue underneath the epithelial tissue in the mucous membrane. Next, serous membranes we've talked about in a couple of chapters already before. These are inside the closed ventral body cavity, so it's not open to the exterior. The only way you're going to see that is if you cut through something to see that. It's always going to be made out of simple squamous epithelial tissue, so when we talked about mesothelium, that is a serous membrane. We also mentioned that there were 3 serous membranes that you have in the body. First is the pleural membrane, which surrounds the lungs. Keep in mind all of your serous membranes have 2 layers to them, a parietal and then a visceral layer. The parietal layer is closer to the chest wall or the abdominal wall. The visceral layer is closer to the organ itself. So if you were cutting from outside the body in, you're going to cut through the parietal pleura first and then the visceral pleura, and then you'd actually be getting into the lungs after that. Pericardium, same thing around the heart. The parietal is against the chest wall. The visceral layer is against the heart itself. Remember that serous membranes have that fluid-filled space between those 2 layers, and that fluid helps to reduce friction as you have the organs moving around in there. Peritoneum is in the abdominal cavity, and it surrounds mostly digestive organs, although some of the reproductive organs are lined by this as well. The blue layer in the picture would be the parietal layer. The sort of pink layer in the picture would be the visceral layer, so notice that it goes around a lot of different organs there. Next, your book shifts gears and it starts to talk about wound healing and what happens if you are injured. A couple of words to get to before we get to the steps to tissue repair. Regeneration basically means you make more of the same kind of tissue. So if you cut through epithelial tissue, you can make more epithelial tissue to fix that. That would be regeneration. Some tissues are really good at regeneration and some aren't. And there are very few human body parts that can actually regenerate if you were to remove them. The story behind this picture here, and this is a news story from CNN, basically she had been leaning down to take off her shoes with her hand on the door frame as she was going into her house, and somebody slammed the door shut because her dog was trying to run out the door, and it clipped her pinky tip off, and this is actually the old tip to her pinky right there. She went in and tried to get them to reattach it, and the doctors in her area refused to do that and said it wouldn't work. It would be a 100% chance of failure is what they told her. She didn't take that as an acceptable thing, and so for several weeks she researched and tried to figure out what she could do to either reattach her old finger or somehow regrow a new pinky tip. She finally found some orthopedists that were working on regeneration and found something called Matrastim, which is the brand name of this series of chemicals that is supposed to help with tissue regeneration. And basically she went in, they reopened the wound, they did something called debriding, which is where they scrape off dead tissue so they can get it back down to healthy tissue. And then it said in the article that they dipped her finger in that Matrastim and then dressed the wound, and that several weeks later, this is her pinky afterwards, this side off over here. She said her pinky is a little shorter than it was before, but that if you're looking at it from far away, you can't tell that she had to regrow that top portion right there. One thing that I want to mention about that is this is, first off, very, very rare for us to regrow anything. Second, because some of our tissues cannot do regeneration, she can't feel the tip of her finger, even still to this day, because you can't regenerate nervous tissue. At least we haven't figured out how to get that done just yet. And so while she has a tip and she is functional, like she said she can type, it's still not going to be exactly the same as it was before. So the whole key to regeneration is it's replacing something you've lost with the exact same thing. Okay. Contrast that with fibrosis. Because some of your tissues can't regenerate, instead what your body does to try to seal the wound is replace it with fibrous connective tissue, like dense regular or dense irregular connective tissue. And so what you're looking at here is a skin wound. You could see where it had actually been sutured at some point. But this stuff that's running right through here, that's not normal epithelial tissue. Instead, it's been replaced by fibrous connective tissue. And that's because the wound here was large enough that we can just see the scar tissue that's underneath it. And so fibrosis, it's a way for you to heal, but it's not going to be as good as regeneration because you didn't replace it with the same kind of tissue. Scar tissue is basically the result of fibrosis. So scar tissue is fibrous connective tissue plus anything that could regenerate on top of that. Okay. After that, you have what are the steps to tissue repair, and they are listed for you in order there. And yeah, sorry, gross pictures, probably should have warned you in advance. What you're looking at here in these pictures is something called Fournier's gangrene. It's usually gotten through sexually transmitted infections. It's more common in people of lower socioeconomic status, and prison populations, especially outside of America, tend to get this more often than other people. But this shows you the 3 steps that are going on right there for the gangrene that this unfortunate gentleman has gotten. In the first picture, you can see inflammation because his scrotum is very large. There's also something that the book has not mentioned at this point, I think, called necrosis. Necrosis is when tissue starts to die, and you can see that because it's gotten very dark in this region right here. But the swelling is inflammation. Once tissue becomes necrotic, it's basically got to go. Otherwise, it's going to set the stage for infection. And so that had to be, again, debrided or removed from this person. Second step is, once inflammation helps to set the stage for repair, you're going to do what's known as reorganization. And you start to replace tissue with newly formed tissue. It's usually pink, and that's what you're looking at here is granulation tissue. That's the result of reorganization. So notice our scrotum's basically gone at this point. Again, we had to remove it because it was infected over here. The testicles do have granulation tissue forming on top of those. Now at this point, this man elected to have a procedure where they removed portions of his thigh skin and then flipped it around to basically rebuild him a scrotum. And so what you're looking at here in the third picture is that was the skin that used to be sitting right here. They've pulled it off and then sutured the 2 sides together so that he has a scrotum, because guys need a scrotum. It's just kind of an important thing to have. These drains right here are trying to make sure any infection can still get out so he doesn't get reinfected from the same thing. But the third step is to seal all of those wounds up. And you do that with those 2 words from earlier, regeneration, build new epithelial tissue. If you can fix any of the connective tissue down below, areolar, adipose, any of that sort of stuff, go ahead and regenerate that tissue. Anything that you can't regenerate, fibrous scar tissue is going to form and seal that up. And so right here you have fibrosis, but here you have regeneration. So both of those are going to work together to try to seal the wound up. Okay. Next up, you have which type of tissue is the best at regeneration, and epithelial tissue is by far the best at regeneration, so all you really need there is epithelial. Some of the other tissues are decent at it, areolar, adipose, bone is pretty good at regeneration, but epithelial is the best, so just make sure you get that one. After that, which types of tissue are the worst at regeneration? These are the 3 that I want you to get down. If you don't remember our tissues from earlier, go back and study those because you need to know them. This one over here is hyaline cartilage, but just put cartilage in general. All of the cartilage is avascular, so it doesn't heal very well. Over here you have nervous tissue. Remember, you have cells with appendages, axons, and dendrites. And axons and dendrites and nervous tissue as a whole are not super awesome at regeneration. And then down here you have cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle isn't very good at regeneration either, but smooth muscle actually is okay. Okay. Next, you have what are adhesions. First, what you need to understand here is these usually relate to surgery. So say you went in to have some sort of a procedure done. If your body starts to go overboard on the fibrosis, it will make more scar tissue than it needs to. And at that point, what happens is that scar tissue starts to stick things together that weren't supposed to stick together. So here in this picture, this big brown thing is liver. This muscle up here at the top is the diaphragm. Those two things are not supposed to be attached like it's showing you right here. And so these are adhesions that formed. Maybe the person had gallbladder surgery. I don't know the whole story behind the picture. But that's what happens is you start to form scar tissue that connects those two things together. So adhesions, scar tissue that's attaching things that aren't supposed to be attached together. All right. At that point, your book switches gears again, and it starts talking about how do tissues form embryonically from the moment that you're conceived through adulthood, basically. This is an embryo that's about 2 weeks old in this picture, and I know it doesn't look anything like a human baby. It looks kind of like a tongue, but that's what embryos look like at that point in time. At this point, an embryo has something called primary germ layers. They are the layers that make up an embryo, so they're just the early tissue layers that have formed in the developing baby. There are 3 primary germ layers, and they're color-coded for you in the picture: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, and those are the next 3 for us to get down. I want to say your book has this table in it, but I can't remember, and I don't have the book with me on this ice day. The parts that you need to get down, I started with ectoderm next. You need to know the ectoderm makes the epidermis of the skin, and you need to know it makes the nervous system. Now, those two things don't seem like they go together at all, but that's the way it works. Ectoderm makes your coverings, and it makes the nervous system. Okay. Endoderm is what I did next in the notes. So the endoderm makes all your mucous membranes, and so just get mucous membranes, which it doesn't say that, but that's what all of these things are. Epithelial lining in the digestive tract, it's a mucous membrane. Mesoderm, what you need to get for that is these 2 right here in the middle. Makes the skeletal system and the muscular system. Another way to look at that is it makes connective tissue and it makes muscle. So that's what the mesoderm is going to make for you. Okay. Once again, switch gears for the book, and at that point it starts to talk about cancer. So first, you have neoplasm. Neoplasm is basically a growth or a tumor, if you want to look at it that way. Here you're looking at a growth in the oral cavity. You can see the teeth and the tongue. That's just a neoplasm. It's just a growth. Next, benign and malignant are words used to describe growths, and basically benign means good and malignant means bad. To elaborate on that just a little bit though, what you need to get for benign is it does not spread to new tissue types. We're going to call that metastasis here in a little bit, but it doesn't spread. And they usually have a capsule around them, and what that means is if a doctor goes in to surgically try to remove them, they can see exactly where it starts and stops, so they know they get the whole thing out. Now, that does not mean it doesn't get to be really big. Now, supposedly this is a 100-pound tumor. It's still benign though, because we were able to remove the whole thing all at once, and because it did not spread into other areas. It just stayed as one big growth, all connected together. Malignant, on the other hand, is the bad one, and it's bad for a couple reasons. One, it spreads to new areas, and a lot of times it's going to spread to the lymph tissue, which means it gets into a lymph node, and then that lymph node becomes cancerous. And so it doesn't stay there. That gets cancerous, and that makes this area cancerous, and then that might make another one cancerous. So it's metastatic is the word for that. Second, it does not have discrete boundaries. Now, when you're looking at it in an x-ray, you can kind of see, especially this area right here where it starts to get lighter, but if you're a surgeon in there, you don't know if you're supposed to cut here or here. And so most of the time, they're going to go ahead and remove the whole breast because they can't see exactly where it starts and stops. So even though this one's like the size of, I don't know, maybe a lima bean. I don't know how large that woman's breast was, unfortunately. But even though it's way smaller than this is one that you definitely don't want your doctor telling you you have, because that is going to have way more medical involvement in terms of getting you better, and it's going to have a much higher chance of actually killing you than even this giant one's going to, because this one was benign and this one was malignant. So, doesn't spread, spreads. Okay, that fancy word for spreading is metastatic, or metastasis, is as you're seeing it right there. All it means is the cancer is growing and then spreading into new areas. So as you're looking at this picture, and again, I've talked earlier about, like, I showed you a melanoma picture and I told you that it did not respect the boundary. You're supposed to have your epithelial tissue staying above the basement membrane. If it goes below that, you're starting to grow cells in places where those cells are not supposed to be. If they have spread out of that tissue entirely and moved into the lymph system or the circulatory system, that's what metastatic is. It's not just they didn't respect the border, it's they way didn't respect the border and they've totally entered a new country at that point. Okay, next, carcinogen is anything that can promote cancer, usually used to describe chemicals that can promote cancer. So here you're looking at some of the components that you can find in cigarette smoke, and everything that is starred is carcinogenic. So you got naphthalene, pyrene, cadmium, urethane, dibenzicardine, and polonium-210, all being carcinogenic that's in there. There's some other stuff that you just don't want, like you should not be inhaling acetone. It's the same thing you have in fingernail polish remover. Notice that this one right here can be fatal. We used it in gas chambers, back when we did gas chambers. DDT is an insecticide. VC or vinyl chloride is part of PVC, hence the used in plastic materials thing. So none of those are things that you really want to inhale. The whole thing that anybody's smoking this for is for that one little thing right there, but you're also inhaling all of these other horrible things that do horrible things to your body. Now, the way most carcinogenic substances work is they usually mutate your DNA, and if you mutate some important genes, it allows cells to do mitosis more often than they are supposed to, and that's when the cancer actually develops. Next, Oncogene is a cancer-promoting gene. Anytime you see onco, it means growth, and oncologists are doctors who study that, so they're basically cancer doctors. The one that I'm showing you right here, sometimes called BRCA1 or BRCA1, is a gene that has been linked to cancer. If a person has a mutated version of that, it makes it more likely that they will develop breast cancer later in life. P.S. Whoever made this picture spelled chromosome wrong. There's an E at the end of that. What it basically amounts to, you have all of these genes that code for substances called growth factors. And growth factors are chemicals that we check for at cell checkpoints to determine whether or not a cell is supposed to enter mitosis or not. If you have a mutated version of that gene, it allows a cell to pass a checkpoint when it should not have passed a checkpoint. And so that cell divides to make 2, those 2 make 4, even though we're not supposed to be doing that. So we want the normal version that controls regulation. If it's broken, it's an oncogene. Next, tumor suppressor gene does exactly what the name says. It suppresses a tumor. These are growth regulators, and like that slide says, they basically try to put the brake pedal on mitosis so that cells don't divide. If they don't divide, you can't get a tumor. One thing that I would like to mention at this point is a break in one gene by itself, like going back to that BRCA1 gene, if you have a mutated version of that, it doesn't mean you're 100% going to get breast cancer. It increases the risk because you already have one broken gene. In order to get full-blown cancer, it usually takes several broken genes. This one right here, each one of these things that is listed with either a red thing or a green arrow, that's a separate gene that has to get broken to go from a normal cell into a full-on cancerous cell. So usually, like for colon cancer, there's a couple of tumor suppressor genes that are broken, and there's a couple of oncogenes that are broken. So it takes several. That's why elderly people are more likely to get cancer. It's because they've had a longer period of time to actually break some of those genes, and so they're just more likely to get it. Okay. Next, a biopsy is what's used to diagnose cancer. It's basically they stick in what is essentially a large needle most of the time, and they take a plug of tissue out, and then they make slides so they can start to view it. This one is showing you how they do an endometrial biopsy. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus. And this picture shows you the results. These are actually from mares, which are female horses, if you don't know, instead of people, but they have endometria too. All right, next, cancer stages. They are the stages that a person would go through from the moment they have cancer until the moment they get better. Stage 0 is not really cancer. They would call that pre-cancer. Stage 1 is where you've actually been diagnosed with cancer, and like it says there, it's localized, it's not spreading, it's usually relatively easy to treat it at that point. Stage 4 is also called end-stage cancer, because unfortunately when people get to that point, pretty good chance that they're not going to make it through the therapy, although depending on the therapy they might have a chance still, but it's already spread into other places. When a person gets diagnosed, they are put into one of those stages right there, and it just helps the doctor figure out how rigorous they need to be with their treatments. All right, then you have what are some of the methods that can be used to treat cancer. I'm going to start with this one up over here. First and foremost, surgical removal. You take the tumor out. If it's spread to other places, you take those places out as well. This woman's had a mastectomy because she had breast cancer. I kind of thought she was creative in the way she decided to deal with that. Some women will go ahead and do breast, you can't really call it replacement, but they'll do breast implants to help her get breasts back. They will also, in that particular case, because most people don't realize this, when they take the breast, they take the nipple. And so if they put implants in, it will be a breast with no nipple, and so usually the woman will have a nipple tattooed on. This woman just decided to just go for the tattoo instead of the breast implants and then the tattoo of the nipple, so that was her strategy. After surgical removal, chemotherapy may or may not be necessary. What I want you to notice here is this: dispose of properly. Chemotherapy is super toxic chemicals that are specifically designed to prevent mitosis. If you think about the side effects that people get when they're on chemotherapy, their hair falls out. Well, in order to make more hair, you have to do mitosis. If you can't do mitosis, you can't make more hair. They tend to throw up or have diarrhea a lot, and that's because the cells in the intestines and the stomach are slopping off more quickly and they're not being replaced as quickly. They tend to have lower blood counts of everything, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and that's because bone marrow is supposed to do mitosis to make those things. And so that's why they have problems with all of those. It's because chemotherapy stops or dramatically slows mitosis. Final one that I'll give you here is radiation. Radiation, it can be used to try to decrease the size of tumors. That's used for like a bone marrow cancer or something where they can't go in, well, and surgically remove it very easily. At least they'll go for radiation in that case. After that, in the notes, you just have your Latin roots and your related clinical terms, and just make sure you have those all filled out. On Tuesday, assuming that nothing else weather-related happens, we're going to go ahead and start the next chapter, which is chapter 5. So be ready for that one.